Welcome to how history, laws, and societal norms continue to exclude users with disabilities from the digital experience. My name is Lynn Wehrman, and I am the president and founder of Digital Accessibility by WeCo. This presentation was written and presented at Open Source North 2023 in St. Paul, Minnesota on April 24th. As I researched and wrote this presentation, one word kept popping up in my head over and over: intention. Do human beings intend to exclude other human beings? In some cases, certainly. However, I believe that most of us intend to include. However, our attempts at inclusion can get off track and have unintended consequences, especially in areas where we are uncertain, unaware, and most importantly, in areas where we feel uncomfortable. Discomfort is a funny thing. We will do things we wouldn't normally do to avoid it. Among them, deviating from our normal processes in order to get something over or fixed so that we can get away from the discomfort as quickly as possible. It's my hope that what you're about to hear will help you recognize that discomfort and use it to redefine your intentions around inclusion, to own what you don't know, and to inspire you to find genuine knowledge to include in your projects, not only for users with disabilities, but for everyone. I'd like to begin by introducing you to our company. Digital Accessibility by WeCo was founded by me and a group of community stakeholders who are working on the Americans with Disabilities Act transition plan at the Minnesota Department of Transportation. For me, the project was a work assignment. For them, it was part of a desire to make meaningful change for themselves and people living with disabilities in the community. Today, WeCo is the first and only digital accessibility company that puts living with a disability as a requirement on our position descriptions for our technical roles. Presently, every person working with and for WeCo lives with one or more disability. We've been a recipient of the National Organization on Disability Leading Disability Employer Award since our first application in 2019. I'd also like to give you some context about the position I'm speaking from today as a person living with 2 cognitive disabilities. I and my 4 sisters were diagnosed with different forms of epilepsy. If you are a visual user, what you're seeing on this slide is a study in contrast. On the photo on the left is me with my sisters, and I'm on the far left wearing the black and tan blouse. On your right is a photo of me taken 6 years later, looking much heavier and sad, unhealthy, following a misdiagnosis after misdiagnosis of what appeared to be then bipolar disorder. After over 10 years of struggle, I discovered that I had been living with a mild form of borderline personality disorder. I was fortunate to have a therapist and a psychiatrist who put together the pieces. I was equally lucky that the method to treat BBD, called dialectical behavioral therapy, had just come to Minnesota. It saved my life and helped me move forward to raise a daughter, begin a career in my late 30s, and eventually found an amazing business where professionals with disabilities can function as experts. To begin, I'd like to give you an overall contextual backdrop for this discussion. Let's take a look at how user experience is managed for people with and people without disabilities. User experience has focused on getting at the desires and needs of the user. Columbia School of Engineering describes it this way: user experience, or UX, refers to the experiences, feelings, and perceptions that one has when interacting with a company's products, services, and engagement channels. And I'd like to emphasize experiences, feelings, and perceptions. That's going to be important to remember as we move forward in this presentation. Prior to the dawn of AI, software and website UX had been conducted most often through these methods: UX testing, or using trained individuals who conduct tests to vet for usability; UX teams, or teams of individuals focused on vetting usability; and focus groups, or including the feedback of the end user in determining usability. In the 2000s, awareness around digital accessibility begins to take root. The accessibility universe begins to emerge, and a handful of companies create what we now see as a flooded field of manufacturers focused on developing accessibility software. In 2012, the Obama White House released a report to Congress on how U.S. government departments were doing adhering to their own accessibility requirements, or Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. The findings were disappointing, but a new focus was put on website and software accessibility because companies who depended upon selling software to the government entities now had to comply with Section 508 reporting, called Voluntary Product Accessibility Templates, or VPATs, in order to complete their sales. From my bird's-eye view at the time, this is when everyone decided it was time to get in the game of making money from accessibility. And the fastest and easiest way to do that was through focusing on the premise that the feedback of users with disabilities could be automated. So let's talk about where the automated accessibility industry is taking us: widgets and overlays. If you've even stumbled through the accessibility universe, you've heard the product names. You've seen the advocacy groups not allowing the companies who make these products at their conferences. You've seen the non-apologies and then the apologies by the manufacturers. And if you keep your eye on the legal part of this universe, you've seen the number of these tools being named in lawsuits rise. But despite it all, the industry is still focused on excluding the input of users with disabilities regarding their own accessibility needs. And the momentum is building. As of November last year, the U.S. accessibility software market is estimated at near 500 million and projected to reach 606 million by the year 2027. This research from Straits indicates that, quote, a high concentration of established enterprises in the U.S. are seeking to maintain their place, increase their market share by focusing on automated technologies. This is not even taking into account AI tools for accessibility. Yet, laws in countries like the US, Australia, India, and Canada require that users with disabilities be consulted in the accessibility process. Still, no significant investment is occurring in companies like ours that address the gap between the automated accessibility industry and consulting users with disabilities. That is why we concluded this information in our business plan. The arguments that we hear from companies are the same arguments potential clients gave us 10 years ago when we were founded. There are too few users with disabilities for us to make this effort, though this argument is rapidly fading as our population ages, or it's too complicated and too costly. One primary argument that we've encountered, as explained to us by one of our clients, is a belief that people with disabilities can't understand or articulate their own needs. In our second year of business, there was a company local to our area that really wanted to use us, believed in what we were doing, and was already using a prominently known dashboard product for accessibility. So they felt that we would be an excellent fit to work with that dashboard to have a human interface. So they mentioned this to the company that they were working with that manufactured the dashboard. And the rep from that company quite honestly said to our project manager, wait a minute, people with disabilities can't understand their own digital needs or give you actionable information on that. And that was something that I wrote down because I thought it was so important to remember, hoping that someday we would move past that. Here's hoping. Next, we'll take a look at how we as human beings have handled disability throughout history. It tells us a great deal about ourselves and how we view disability today. Throughout history, people have grappled with how to describe the disabilities we live with. It's arguable that our less than elegant attempts are what got us moving in the wrong direction in the first place. Prior to the 1900s, the way we described disability were highly varied, less formalized, and less discussed as they are today. Tied to the belief that disability was a type of personal flaw, terms like lame, crippled, or invalid were commonly used. If I had lived prior to 1900 with my two cognitive disabilities, terms like idiot or imbecile may have been used to describe me. Interestingly enough, as society began to view idiot or imbecile as derogatory terms for people with cognitive disabilities, they were replaced by retarded, which was seen as a kinder reference. And I think this is an important point because it goes back to that intention. So when I look back through history and see these terms, I realize that those people used those terms because that was where their knowledge was. That was where their thinking was. And we strive to be better than that. We strive to go beyond that. And while I do not believe that was ill intended, I think it is something that we can learn from and realize that we can move forward and be different. To understand disability reference and its evolution over history, it's important to understand how it developed as a social model. In the 1500s, disability is seen as a flaw, affliction. People with disabilities are viewed from a standpoint of needing charity rather than having rights. It defines those of us with disabilities as less than others. This model was prevalent for centuries, and in many countries across the world, it's prevalent today. In the 1970s, the disability rights movement emerges, and disability is viewed from a medical model or as a medical condition. It makes disability less of a personal defect, but at the same time removes the person from the equation by focusing on it as a medical problem that needs to be fixed. In the 1980s, the societal model emerges where those of us who live with disabilities claim it as part of our identity, not something that needs to be hidden. And I'd like to read this quote for you from Medical and Societal Models of Disability from the Office of Developmental and Primary Care, University of California, San Francisco, in regards to the medical model and social model. These models provide a framework of how people perceive those of us with disabilities, while the medical model is a helpful way of understanding illness and loss of function. People in the disability community have largely rejected it in favor of the social model. The social model promotes the idea that adapting social and physical environments to accommodate people with a wide range of functional capabilities improves quality of life and opportunity for people with and without impairments. So next is the 1990s to today. I believe we are moving beyond the societal model to one in which those of us with disabilities see ourselves as equals to people without disabilities. We are more than just our disabilities. We are the same as everyone else, but we just do things in a slightly different way. The shift from the moral to the medical model spanned 460 years, while the shift from the medical to the societal model took approximately a decade. The shifts are occurring faster. Models are no longer necessarily dictated entirely by people who are outside of the disability experience. Despite this, disability tropes and myths still abound. As a person living with lifelong mental illness, I can tell you that while acceptance seems to be growing, prejudices in the workplace and in my private life have been, and on some levels continue to be, present, just as they were when I received my diagnosis over 30 years ago. This section is probably the least comfortable of my presentation to hear, but it's crucial for us to grasp how our beliefs and habits as a society from the past continue to shape how we view and treat people with disabilities now. We have a history of setting aside separate space for people who do not fit into their ideals. For instance, in ancient Greece, physical perfection was prized. Disability was generalized as an overreaching issue that could not be addressed. So, for instance, if you were deaf, it was assumed you could not learn because learning required communication and communication required hearing. This is actually a principle that is still present in some South American countries. So, for instance, if you are deaf, you will not be afforded the opportunity to even learn sign language. In Rome, disability was viewed as the god's wrath. There was no Latin term for the word disabled, so Romans used the word monstrum, which was the word used for mythical monsters. Children with disabilities were often left to die in the woods. Throughout history, it has been viewed as acceptable to not integrate people with disabilities into society. We have been relegated to living in poverty or even begging in the streets. In some places in the world, little has changed. Even here in the US, the concept of having a disability renders you less capable is prevalent. Where we live when we live with a disability speaks volumes regarding how society views us. In the 1700s in colonial America, we created poor farms or almshouses where people with disabilities lived communally in what was viewed on the outside as a supportive setting. The conditions were overcrowded, disease-ridden, and far from safe and supportive. By the 1800s, we see the emergence of asylums for the insane. While this included individuals living with mental illness, people living with physical disabilities were also committed to asylums. Living here was not voluntary, and people were legally assigned there as wards of the state. This is where we see a fundamental shift in how society viewed and treated people with disabilities. In Minnesota, one such institution was founded in 1858 outside of Stillwater called Pine Point Farm. Funded by the wealthy citizenry of Stillwater out of a desire to help the less fortunate, the farm finally ceased operations in 1957 and the residential facility closed in 1977. It's currently used as a bed and breakfast and wedding venue. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, eugenics began to influence how people with disabilities were viewed and treated. Eugenics is a misguided belief that controlling genetics could improve the human race. Some doctors practiced forced sterilization on persons they deemed unfit, removing their ability to have children. Other physicians also performed lobotomies to cut connections between parts of the brain, believing lobotomies could significantly reduce mania or highly disturbing behavior. Thousands of lobotomies were performed in the 1940s and 50s, though this practice faded in popularity by mid-century. Forced treatment and hospitalization left a mark on my own family. In the 1930s through the 1950s, my grandfather and his sister were repeatedly hospitalized against their will by law enforcement when the neighboring farmers complained about their behavior. While the paranoia they were experiencing no doubt made their neighbors uncomfortable, they were not demonstrating that they were a danger to others or themselves. Both underwent involuntary electroconvulsive treatment or ECT and ongoing hospitalization against their will in the state hospital at St. Peter, Minnesota. While ECT is still used today in some instances, the patient is now sedated and must consent to the treatment. What my relatives endured must have been terrifying and painful. The 1960s saw another shift in attitudes away from forced hospitalization and blanket treatments for people with disabilities. Hospitals began to close, and the disability rights movement took shape. In 1991, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, and it is still a beacon to the world regarding verbalizing the rights of individuals with disabilities. In 1999, the Olmstead Act was passed, legislating the rights of individuals to live within their communities. It's important to note that people with disabilities and mental illness were housed alongside criminals into the 1900s. When the COVID-19 pandemic emerged, medical shortages became top of mind. The phrase triaged care entered the vocabulary of the general public as we struggled with the realization that a rapidly spreading disease might mean there would not be enough resources to save us all. As the weeks progressed, hospitals and care centers developed critical care crisis triage protocols to provide a baseline of who should receive care first in the event of a shortage of ventilators and staff. Caught in the middle of this were Americans' attitudes towards people living with disabilities. As doctors and nurses began to fumble with the edges of the appropriateness for delaying non-essential care, we saw how patients with disabilities were put at the end of the queue for ventilators, and in some cases, they weren't added to the queue at all. Sarah McSweeney lived with cerebral palsy. She couldn't walk or talk, but used a wheelchair and communicated with hand gestures. She loved makeup and going to shopping malls. She loved country music and went to see Tim McGraw in concert twice. She made people laugh and had a vivacious smile. On April 21, 2020, Sarah had a high fever that was later diagnosed as COVID-19, so her staff took her to the hospital emergency room. And this I'm reading from National Public Radio's feature on Sarah. It's normal for a doctor to want to understand a patient's wishes. However, Barnett, Sarah's caregiver, who kept daily notes on her conversations with medical workers about McSweeney, felt the doctor was challenging the order. They wanted it to be DNR, says Barnett. A do not resuscitate order is a medical order to doctors not to treat a patient if they stop breathing or if their heart stops. The emergency room doctor would be the first at the hospital to raise a question that would shadow decisions about McSweeney's care over nearly 3 weeks at the hospital. Why does a woman with a significant and complex disabilities have a legal order that requires the hospital to take all measures to save her life? McSweeney was 45 when she died on May 10th. Her death would raise another question, one that people with disabilities and the elderly have worried about since the start of the coronavirus pandemic. Are they denied care when it gets scarce, like drugs or treatment, including ventilators, that might save their lives? We had a similar issue happen a slightly different way in the WeCo family. As soon as the state of Minnesota announced that we were all to stay at home, we had 2 members of our team, Maureen, who is one of our testers and one of our salespeople, and Maureen is blind and is in a wheelchair, and her husband, Paul, who has no arms and 1 leg. Now, Paul and Maureen are quite independent in many ways, and they were very used to ordering their groceries online. As soon as the stay-at-home order was issued, everyone was ordering groceries online, and Maureen and Paul could not get food to their house. There was no special dispensation at that time. At the start of that pandemic, there was no consideration for people living with disabilities, so many people with disabilities were without services that they depended upon. What Maureen and Paul did instead, Paul has a specialized van that enables him to drive. So they went to the store, and I recall Maureen telling me the story of Paul pushing the cart with his head and instructing Maureen where the items were on the shelf so she could grab them and put them in the cart. And luckily, someone in the grocery store saw them struggling and helped them. And of course, when we heard that in our company, then we had volunteers within our company that came to help Maureen and Paul, and eventually their neighbors and people from their church helped as well. But I think it's really important to understand that the priorities that we have for people who are most vulnerable in our community, regarding people with disabilities, those priorities aren't there in a crisis. So I think that's just an important consideration to keep in mind. Next, we'll examine the laws we set around disability and how they relate to the disability model. U.S. laws from both the past and the present continue to approach those of us with disabilities from the moral or less than model. Case in point, the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, also known as the Subminimum Wage Law. This law allows employers to register a position held by a person with a disability and receive government approval to pay them less than minimum wage. What it does is it makes a blanket assumption about those of us with disabilities and our capabilities. The standard subminimum wage standard was something that was applied to the creation of sheltered workshops that were funded by the government and nonprofits. And this was originally a well-intentioned plan to employ people that society felt were unemployable or people who were not able to be as productive as others in society. This is something that we are rethinking as a society, and there have been recent efforts to change this and integrate people working in those workshops into wider society and employment. Just like references like idiot or imbecile, we now see this idea something that needs to be abandoned for better ideas. The Americans with Disabilities Act is something that is undergoing a legal tug of war. Web accessibility standards in line with the primary website accessibility measurement, WCAG, were to be released in regards to the ADA in 2017. In 2018, the DOJ dropped the accessible web requirement altogether. And in 2022, soft website guidance was issued, awaiting the latest update of the WCAG. Through all this, the obvious practicality of including people with disabilities and being able to access websites and software is something that most of us can see, which is evidenced on this slide. There's a quote from a Massachusetts District Court Judge, Ponzer, in regards to the National Association of Deaf versus Netflix on Instant Watch video ruling. And I will read from this. It would be irrational to conclude that places of public accommodation are limited to actual physical structures in a society in which business is increasingly conducted online. Excluding businesses that sell services through the internet from the ADA would run afoul of the purpose of the ADA and would severely frustrate Congress's intent that individuals with disabilities fully enjoy the goods, services, privileges, and advantages available indiscriminately to other members of the general public. And this, at the time in 2012, when this was released, was something that most of us said, well, of course, and how nice it was that the legal world had somebody verbally chiming in on this. A Florida trial court ruled that Winn-Dixie's public website was, indeed, a place of public accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act. In April 2021, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals overturned the trial's court verdict, finding that the retailer did not violate the ADA because its website was not a place of public accommodation and did not pose an intangible barrier to its goods, services, and advantages. And that is because Winn-Dixie is a physical store. It is a grocery store chain. California Unruh Act. In Martinez versus Cotton Wash Incorporated, the Second Appellate District declined to extend the meaning of a place of public accommodation under Title III to digital-only websites. What these changes demonstrate is the law's view that compliance with accessibility laws are a burdensome requirement. They continue to reinforce the exclusion of people with disabilities from the digital realm. An additional layer to the tug-of-war of the ADA are pre-notification laws such as H.R. 620 or the ADA Education Reform Act of 2017. This bill is explained very well on the Perkins School for the Blind website. Quote, H.R. 620 is a bill that would require people with disabilities to find, determine, and report buildings that are in violation of the ADA. This means that buildings wouldn't have to be made accessible unless someone tells the business they are not accessible and says exactly what the issue is, and only after doing these things can the person take legal action. Consider what it's like if you're in a wheelchair and trying to go to a wedding, or simply trying to find a restroom. Laws like H.R. 620 exclude and place the burden of inclusion on the person with a disability. Finally, here are my conclusions. Please keep in mind that they are my conclusions. You will certainly have your own. To understand how history, societal norms, and the laws that spring from them influence how we as designers, developers, coders, content managers, and organizational leaders approach creating access to the digital realm for those of us who live with disabilities, we need look no further than the disability model timeline. When we do, we find ourselves demonstrating an attitude towards users with disabilities that appears to vacillate between the historic attitudes of the 1500s through the mid-1900s. In the 1500s, disability is seen as a flaw, affliction. People with disabilities are viewed from a standpoint of needing charity rather than having rights. It defines those of us with disabilities as less than others. We see the sub-minimum wage law developed in the 1930s upholding that model of charity rather than rights in the workplace. The same approach continues today in the digital realm as we witness the push and pull of the legal system, boldly debating whether or not equal inclusion in the digital world is something for which businesses and governments should be accountable for. We see the continued relevance of the less than model in H.R. 620, legalizing organizations' abilities to maintain inaccessible public buildings unless a complaint is filed by a person with a disability. Taking a look at the medical model, where disability is viewed as a medical condition, something that requires fixing, remediating. It implies strongly that what must be done digitally to include is extra or above and beyond. We use terms like remediate to describe something that should already be present, equal access. Like the medical model, digital accessibility approaches unapologetically leave out the input of users living with disabilities. Despite lawsuits and a chorus of complaints from those of us with disabilities, companies in the established digital accessibility space remain firmly fixed on things like accessibility dashboards, automatic accessibility overlays and widgets, training people without disabilities to simulate our disabilities. Perhaps most telling is the fixation the law and the industry has on checklists for accessibility that does not take into account the impact of users living with disabilities. Even manual accessibility audits, which are a legal standard in digital accessibility court cases, are largely conducted by experts who do not live with disabilities. User testing with people living with disabilities is anything but commonplace. It is so rare to consider people with disabilities as digital experts that I couldn't find any stats on people with disabilities working in the digital accessibility industry. The only measurement of our participation I could find was that our company, WeCo, was the only digital accessibility company listed as a current National Organization on Disability's leading disability employer. There isn't a magic formula to moving your team or organization past the old exclusionary models of how we think about disability. It can only happen when honest conversations occur. When teams can safely and openly talk about why users with disabilities aren't being included in processes, only then can real change happen. But everyone must feel free to state what they see as the truth, voice things we don't often talk about or feel comfortable saying. These questions can help your team get started. Do your accessibility goals include covering our liability with automation, focusing on checklists our dashboard gives us, consulting experts who speculate about or simulate disabilities? And what is holding us back from including users with disabilities? It's faster, it's easier. We don't know who to ask. We don't know how to ask. We aren't certain the feedback will be credible or actionable, which honestly, I understand the reservations in the last one, and that is why trained professionals who live with disabilities are a great answer to that. So these are designed to get your conversation going and to get you really thinking about why you're making your choices. Make contact. Talking with those of us who live with a variety of disability types is the best education you can give yourself and your team. And it doesn't have to be formal or costly. Most national disability advocacy groups have local chapters who are excited to work with you. Even in a company where all of us live with disabilities at WeCo, we have worked with organizations that can help us understand disabilities even better outside our own personal disability experiences. One example is the local chapter of Autism Works has provided training to our staff on how to work with team members and testers who live with autism. You get the idea. For us, this has become a routine that we're including as part of a quarterly meeting with our staff. We also encourage you to take advantage of free learning resources found on our website, theweco.com/resources. From live and recorded webinars, events, live meetups, and blogs, you'll learn not only about digital accessibility, but the people who are most impacted by it. And remember, those of us living with disabilities make up 15% of the planet. We are the largest unrecognized minority group in the US and the world. The World Health Organization estimates that people living in wealthier countries like the US will spend on average 11.5% or 8 years of their lives living with some form of disability. For people in less wealthy countries, that rate is higher. As the world population ages, disability rates are exploding. It's a wonderful time to figure this out. I encourage you to stay in touch with me and our company, Digital Accessibility by WeCo. That's what we're here for. You can reach us at accessinfo@theweco.com or my personal email address, lynn@theweco.com. Thank you.